Hello, I've got a question about a name pronunciation. Miss Kelly, could you tell me the correct pronunciation of your last name?
Sure, it's Kinehan.
Kinehan. Okay,
Thanks for asking.
you're welcome. Thank you. Thank you. One last one for Miss Cathy. Is it Cathy Kuhn? Could you pronounce that for me, please, Miss Cathy?
It's actually Kuhn.
Kuhn. Okay. I couldn't hear you. I can't hear you very well. Can you say that again?
I
Okay.
need to turn up my volume.
There you go. Yeah, that sounds much better. Thank
Okay,
you.
good.
Cathy Kuhn. Thank you, Miss Cathy.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight as we talk about Louisville's Land Development Code. My name is Tahisha Rollins, and I work for AARP here in Kentucky. And I'm really glad that you all decided to join us tonight as we talk about how Metro's Office of Planning and Design is working towards updating the Land Development Code. Last year in July, the Metro Government Council asked the Metro Office of Planning and Design to do a complete review of the Land Development Code and to identify and address issues with the regulations and policies that have inequitable impacts on Louisville residents. In advance of that review, Planning and Design staff worked with Opticos Design on a land review diagnosis that focused on housing. This review led to the discovery of numerous outdated, ill-advised, and downright racist policies. The very policies created in the 1900s, the policies that led to redlining and other discriminatory actions, are still governing our land use policies today. There were so many issues with the current land development code that staff from planning and design decided not to rush the process. They understood that this would be a 12 to 18-month process to address each issue, and that it would be best to break the process into phases. So right now, we're here just to talk about phase one, and that began with conversations and listening sessions that Metro Planning and Housing and Design started in October of last year, and then workshops that they did in December. They spoke to groups around the city by invitation and by request, and worked in coordination with groups to participate in webinars, Zoom calls, and on radio programs across the city. All of these meetings, along with the review, led to 6 recommendations. Tonight's guest will answer questions regarding the 6 recommendations in phase one. For decades, advocates have tried to update and amend these policies. In fact, there was an article in the Courier Journal in 1946 where once again, updates and amendments failed. The time is now. It's actually past time that Louisville step into the 21st century and update the Land Development Code. Now, let me introduce our moderator for the evening, Ms. Krystal Goodner. Krystal Goodner began her media career at WNDA-TV in Clarksville, Indiana, where she operated as a news reporter and producer for more than 2 years in the Metro Louisville market. While there, she was afforded the opportunity to be a member of the press pool for former President Barack Obama's 2008 campaign stop in New Albany, Indiana. Now she is a radio host at the historic station WLOU 104.7 FM 1350 AM and has been crowned with the title of the First Lady of Gospel. She is affectionately known as the Midday Diva because of her candid conversations, information, and industry interviews. Because of those interviews, Ms. Krystal, I'm going to now turn this over to you and let you take it from here. And you are on mute, Ms. Krystal.
Okay, and this is, I guess it wouldn't be an AARP event, me hosting an AARP event, if I was not on mute, Tahisha, okay? I gotta stay true to style. How's everyone doing? Hope you're having a wonderful evening. And I love doing events just like this. And this is much of the work that I was privileged enough to do for WLOU, and that is taking part in community conversation. It almost seems as if the year 2020 was a year for reckoning, a year of trying to make things that were once wrong right. And this lines up with that time for change. Basically, Louisville is working to root out racism in its land development code. The process has been set, the ball has begun to get rolling. And tonight we're going to tell you what information has been gathered and what the next steps are. Are you guys excited? I know I am excited about change, excited about getting an opportunity to bring you into the conversation. And don't forget, you can pose your questions down there in the comments section. So let's get right to it. All right, let's introduce tonight's panelist. Joining us for our discussion is Miss Cathy Kuhn, and Ms. Cathy is the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Housing Coalition. Everyone say welcome, Ms. Cathy. I can hear you. All right, coming up after that is Miss Kelly Kineha. Miss Kelly Kineha, and she's the Assistant Professor in the Department of Urban and Public Affairs at the University of Louisville. Welcome, Kelly. Up next also is Yonah Freemark, and he is the Senior Research Associate for the Urban Institute. Welcome, Mr. Yonah. All right. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Chris French, and he is the Planning and Design Supervisor of the Office of Planning and Design Services. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight and bringing the information to the people. Welcome to this community conversation. Cathy, we will start off with you. Will you give us a brief overview of the 6 recommendations that were presented?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Krystal. Thank you so much. I love the energy that you're bringing to the Land Development Code. We don't often see this enthusiasm about it, so it's awesome to see. Thank you. So I'm going to try and give just a brief update on what these recommendations are, these first initial step recommendations that are being proposed. I'm really not going to go into a whole lot of detail about the recommendations, but I do just kind of want to quickly review them so that, you know, everybody is clear about what's being proposed at this point. And then, you know, if folks do have technical questions that they want to ask, and we've already been, you know, have several that have come in beforehand, but we would encourage you to please put your questions in the chat because we do have a planning and design staff person here with us tonight, Chris, who can really help us to answer any of those more technical questions that some of us lay people are sometimes trying to wrap our heads around. And I do just want to mention that all of this information can also be found on the Planning and Design website under LDC reform recommendations. So I think someone's going to put that in the chat so that folks have access to that link. And then I will just say that, you know, down the line, after more community engagement and public discussion, there will be additional changes recommended. But for right now, there are 6 recommendations that kind of get us started in this process. So next slide, please. So the first recommendation is a new public notice requirement, which essentially just expands the number of people who will receive notice about a change happening on an adjacent property. So in the past, you know, notice was only required to be given to owners of adjacent properties. And this new requirement will, you know, now make it so that notice would be given to all adjacent neighbors, whether or not, you know, they're an owner or a renter. So again, I think the goal is really to sort of notify more people of cases in their neighborhoods and to avoid excluding people who actually live in those neighborhoods. So that's the first recommendation. Next slide, please. The second change is around urban agriculture, which recommends opening up community and market gardens to be able to exist in more zones throughout the city. So community gardens would be able to exist in all zones, and market gardens would be able to exist in 2 additional zones, CR and C3, I believe. And it also removes the parking requirements for community gardens and market gardens and allows some added sort of flexibility in regards to signage and landscape buffers. Next slide, please. The third recommendation is about accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. So these are either attached or detached structures, which are often referred to as, you know, in-law units, or you might hear them called granny flats or carriage houses. So an ADU might be, you know, a converted attic or a basement or, you know, a bump out of an existing home, or it might be a second structure on a particular piece of property. So what this change does is it recommends that ADUs be allowed to exist in any zone that permits residential use. So as now, ADUs are only allowed in certain zoning districts. The change limits the number of ADUs to only 1 per lot. And there are also maximum size limits of either 800 square feet or 30% of the footprint of the principal structure. The recommendation also has limitations on where ADUs can be located on the property, and both detached and attached ADUs would need to meet the setback requirements of the principal structure. There are additional sort of details located in the document on the website that you can sort of look at if you're interested in learning more about this. But just a few other key things to point out about this recommendation is that it does specify that the ADU cannot be utilized as a short-term rental without a conditional use permit. And it also allows ADUs to be permitted with special standards, which means that as long as the standards are met, an owner could build an ADU by right without going through the conditional use permitting process, which is what has to happen now in order for an ADU to be built. Next slide, please. So the fourth change is about setback requirements. So most residential zones currently have requirements that properties are set back 30 feet from the front property line and 25 feet from the rear property line. And so this recommendation is to reduce those setback requirements in order to promote affordability. And this recommendation would also change the code so that 50% rather than 15% of a required rear yard of a buildable lot could be occupied by a detention basin or a retention basin or any other drainage easement. And next slide, please. And then the fifth recommendation is to permit two dwellings in multifamily zones. So currently there are some areas where even if it is a multifamily zone, there is a restriction for only having a single dwelling on the property because of density requirements. So the proposed change would be to allow for two dwellings on all properties currently zoned for multifamily, despite those density requirements. And then the final recommendation also listed on this slide is to remove floor area ratio requirements from consideration when thinking about density. So floor area ratio is really just the relationship between the size of the lot and the size of a building, on the size that a building on that lot can be. So this proposal is to remove a ratio regulations in all residential zoning districts. So that's just a very quick overview of all 6 of the proposed recommendations at this point. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Krystal, because I know we have a number of questions that folks want to get answered.
All right. Thank you so much, Miss Cathy. And again, welcome to this community conversation. We're talking all about the Land Development Code reform, and pose whatever questions you have there down in the chat below. So this next question, either Cathy or Yonah can take. Why is it so important that the LDC reform happen now rather than in the future or perhaps never? Yonah, you're smiling real big. Why don't you take this one first?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be able to share this time with you all. And just to introduce myself, I'm at the Urban Institute, which is a national nonprofit that's been helping out folks in Louisville try to think through the right zoning reforms to really improve affordability and equity in the city. I think the answer to your question is just fundamentally that. We have to make sure that Louisville can move into the future in a way that makes sure that everybody that's in the community can participate, can afford a home, and can live in areas where they want to live. And I think a lot of the code revisions that are being discussed tonight and that will be discussed over the next 2 years are really all about trying to make the community a lot more equitable. So, better now than waiting another 50 years to right the wrongs of the past.
All right, Cathy, you want to jump on the tail end of that? You agree?
I do. I would just say that, as Tahisha mentioned in her introduction, there really is a wealth of research that has shown the degree to which zoning has both, helped to create and cement economic and racial segregation in Louisville, which has led to significant disinvestment and racial disparities in almost every, social and economic and health indicator. And for decades, these restrictions, such as those that require larger lot sizes and single family districts, have been an effective tool for racial segregation. And as Yonah said, the reality is that these changes there hasn't been a change in really over 60 or almost 60 years. And as our city changes, as our demographics change, it's really critical that we are sort of remaining, relevant, and that we're enacting smart changes that are going to allow us to grow along with our city in a way that's going to ensure adequate supply of affordable housing, and in a way that's going to foster strong and healthy and diverse neighborhoods. And I just want to say one more thing is that I think that we're in a moment right now when a global pandemic is showing us, perhaps, like nothing else before, how critical safe and stable housing is to the health and well-being of every single one of us. And so as someone who is, committed to ensuring that all citizens have access to safe and fair and affordable housing, I would argue that, instead of stopping or slowing down the process, it's really critical that we sort of stay the course and stay committed to this process of ensuring that all of our citizens have access to safe housing. I really think the issue is just too important and has too much of an impact on the quality of lives for our citizens to just maybe have stopped because of the pandemic, or just have done nothing, because of the pandemic. And in fact, I think, an 18 to 24 month time frame is probably very appropriate. Personally, I would wish that things would happen more quickly, but I do think that 18 to 24 months does give time for engagement from the community and for education and all of that discussion that needs to happen for these changes that are so important.
Thank you so much, Miss Cathy. And I just want to shout out the people, the viewers that are out there that have taken time out of their evening to learn more and truly be concerned citizens, because the power truly does lie with the people. And so you being here this evening shows how concerned and how invested you are in your community. And that is always good news. Ms. Kelly, could you explain to us how we got here, how we got to the point to where we were able to make changes to the LDC? Could you walk us through that or talk us through that?
So I think that Chris is probably going to be the best person to answer that just from a Metro government perspective, but I'd be happy to, add on to that.
Mr. French.
Yes, thank you. Well, how we got here, Jefferson County or the community adopted a new comprehensive plan, Plan 2040, in 2018 that became effective in January of 2019. As part of that plan, there were recommendations in there. Actually, the previous comprehensive plan didn't have any recommendations, really, didn't have a housing section in particular. There was some recommendations on housing, but there was no housing section. So one of the things with the adoption of Plan 2040 and its implementation, it was really a focus on housing and how we address housing choice and affordability in the community. There's also a push towards trying to make the regulations easier to use and making, code more equitable to the community. And that was really the first step. The next step after that would be some of the work that staff did in terms of, or Louisville Metro did in terms of working on some studies, advancing equity study, which was done by the Department of Development Louisville, as well as the Office of Planning and Design. Looked at equitability issues throughout the community. As was mentioned, I think earlier, we also hired the Opticos Design to do a review of the Land Development Code, in particular with housing in mind, is what they were looking at. And then we did a history of zoning in the community. It was something that the office did, and looked at some of the past zoning practices and what basically how that affected current development and affordability issues in the present day. And then after that, we received support from Mayor Fisher and his office and the administration. Resolutions were adopted by Metro Council, basically directing Planning Commission and Planning and Design Services staff to work on this project. And Planning Commission and it as well adopted a resolution directing staff to work on the LDC reform project, in particular because the Planning Commission serves all the cities within Jefferson County, those with zoning authority as well as those without zoning authority, including Louisville Metro in general. So I think that's kind of how we've got here in terms of why we're doing the project, trying to make the community a more livable community for all residents of Jefferson County. And I think that's our ultimate goal.
And I would just echo some of what Chris already mentioned about, the importance of the comprehensive plan leading to this process, and, the fact that there is language around housing and affordable housing and fair housing, and the importance of that in the comprehensive plan, which sets the stage for this current process of trying to revise the zoning code. And so I think that that's really important and reflects on some of the community engagement processes around the comprehensive plan that are now influencing this process as well.
Well, Kelly, you used the word equity, and a lot of people may be surprised or maybe want to learn more. How can and why does the LDC reform become a racial equity issue? If you could break that down for our viewers for a moment, please.
Sure, yeah. So I think it's important to start with, what do we mean by racial equity when we use that term? And so borrowing some language from the Center for Social Inclusion, when we think about racial equity, first and foremost, it's about recognizing that we're operating within a system that is not balanced, right? And that racism is at the root of and is a key cause of this sort of unbalanced system that we're operating in on a daily basis. And we see evidence of this across Louisville, across our neighborhoods, across our communities. So we have places in Louisville that have access to fresh food and transportation and parks and healthcare. And for the most part, the residents of those neighborhoods tend to be white. And we also have neighborhoods that don't have access to these resources and to these amenities, and that for the most part, residents of those neighborhoods tend to be Black or tend to be people of color. And so these differences that we observe in our neighborhoods and in our communities, these are the result of policies at the local level, policies at the state level, policies at the federal level. But all of these are part of discriminatory patterns on the basis of race. And again, we see the impacts of these things on a regular basis. So in Louisville, we have home ownership rates that are, greatly differ by race and ethnicity. So about 71% of white households or homeowners compared to about 37% of Black or Hispanic households. And so zoning is directly tied up in this, right? So this conversation around the Land Development Code and changing the Land Development Code is directly related to that. So it's an example of this legacy of structural racial inequality that exists in Louisville and that exists in cities, really across the US. And the piece of zoning in particular, I think that helps us connect to these racial equity issues is some of the sort of legally exceptional nature that's found within single family zoning in particular. And so we can trace sort of the history of this and the development of this. And, there's been work in Louisville and there's local sources that, tell this history of zoning and sort of the direct connections to racist and classist roots of this practice. So at the story map that I think someone has already put into the chat, confronting racism and zoning is one example. The redlining Louisville story map is another example. The Fair Housing Report from a couple of years ago is another sort of source for better understanding that history. But that, again, that history helps us to connect to why zoning is part of our structural racial inequalities, and one reason why the Land Development Code reform is a racial equity issue. The other thing that I want to say about this is I think that it's important to recognize that when we're talking about single family zoning, we're not talking about individuals that own single family homes, or we're not talking about, single family homeowners, but it's the legal nature of the zoning category. And I also think it's important to remember that, again, in these conversations about racial equity, that it's about both the outcome of racial equity as well as the process of racial equity. So, that a person's race is no longer going to determine their socioeconomic outcomes is part of what we want to achieve, but also within the processes to get there, that the people that are most impacted by structural racial inequality are part of the decision-making, they're part of the creation, part of the implementation of the policies and plans that come out of those processes.
All right. Wow. A wealth of information. Ms. Kelly, thank you so much for that. Now let's get back to delve into pieces of the recommendations. And you used a term called ADUs or ADUs. Could you talk about that part, why it was recommended? And then another question to that, how do you keep homeowners from turning these ADUs into Airbnbs? So who would like to take that question?
I can take that one. So, so accessory dwelling units, just to kind of let people understand what that is, it's basically another dwelling unit on a property that's considered accessory to the principal dwelling unit on the site. That can be attached to the principal unit, or it can be in a separate accessory structure, like some people think of carriage houses, things like that. But ADUs are also called accessory apartments in some communities. They're called granny flats, or they're called mother-in-law suites. There's different terms for them all around the country, but they're meaning the same thing. It's really an accessory dwelling unit to the principal unit on the property. Currently in the Land Development Code, and this was something that was done in 2003 when the Land Development Code first came into effect, was it created the accessory apartment or accessory dwelling unit conditional use permit. And that's been in place since 2003. And we've had, over the last 10 years, about 36 of these cases filed with the Board of Zoning Adjustment. A small amount when you consider it's basically only allowed in single family zones when you apply for a conditional use permit. And 75% of Jefferson County is zoned for single family. So a very small number of conditional use permits have applied for that over that 10-year period. And if we probably went back to the full, 2003 term, it's probably, it would probably be not much more than that. So one of the reasons for looking at this in terms of the current proposal, the primary reason for the current proposal is to not make it a conditional use permit anymore, is to make it a permitted by right. If you look at any of the literature, including AARP's information on accessory dwelling units, one of the main things to look at is to try to make it easier for people to get these approved and constructed. Making it a conditional use permit process, which requires a large amount of public involvement process, public hearings, a lot of development process, can deter quite a few people from applying for these conditional use permits, as is suggested by the data that we have on how many have been applied for. And so the recommendation was to, or is to allow these as a use of right. However, there will be some standards associated with them, because we have to make sure that they're considered accessory units, and in terms of where they're located on the property compared to the principal structure and how big they are. All those things are included in that proposed regulation. I hope that answered the question. I think it did. Hope it did.
Sure did. And a question from our audience is a question again about the accessory dwelling unit. I think you explained that it's separate, because the question was, does the creation of the accessory dwelling unit separate the ADU from the original property as a separate property? And does the ADU designation remain if a property is sold? That's a good question. Who wants to?
So it has to be considered accessory to the principal use on the property, which would be a single family home. So it wouldn't be able to be separated and still be considered as an accessory unit. And so when someone was to buy the property and it had an accessory dwelling unit on it, they would be taking ownership of that unit as well as the principal. But they really wouldn't be allowed to kind of separate it off from the current property. In addition, I think there was some discussions about short-term rentals, and I think there was a discussion when Cathy was going through the presentation and discussed that you would need a conditional use permit. I think one of the things that we're looking at, based on the comments that we've received so far on this particular recommendation, is that we'll most likely be changing the draft to prohibit the use of ADUs as a short-term rental or Airbnb, whatever you want to call it. So that is something I think that we're going to look at altering in the current draft.
And if you don't mind, Krystal, I thought I would just chime in quickly to say that I think one thing that's really important to understand about these ADUs, they can either be attached to an existing house, be part of an existing house, or be sort of in the back, as Chris was saying, a carriage house. But what's really worth noting about them is that the way the zoning regulation is designed for them, or is proposed to be designed, is that they're not meant to change the look of the neighborhood very much at all. People are not really going to notice these ADUs for the most part. They'll mostly be in people's backyards. We're not talking about high-rise buildings. We're talking about buildings at the scale of the single-family homes around them. And the main point is just to provide new additional housing units that are actually more affordable than the single-family homes in those same neighborhoods. And when you put that together, you give more people the opportunity to live in the communities where they want to live, to go to schools that they want to go to. And it can actually improve the ability of property owners to have a little money on the side from the rental income they would get from the ADU. So when you put all those things together, I think you're talking about a really modest change to a lot of neighborhoods, and one that would allow people to move in. With regards to the conditional use issue that Chris was pointing out, some things that we found at the Urban Institute is that allowing people to just build the ADUs as of right, which means not having to go through that conditional review process, actually increases the number of housing units of ADUs that are built quite significantly. We looked at this in Portland as a comparison case, and they had a massive ramp up in the number of ADUs. Again, just small housing units added to communities and giving more people the ability to come on in. And I think that's really appropriate, given that Today, people can build a single family home in a neighborhood without a conditional review. They can just build a single family home. And we're talking about nothing different for the ADU.
All right, Yonah, thank you so much for taking the time to expound upon that. We've got a lot of questions coming in from our audience. And again, we thank you so much for taking the time this evening to share and participate in this community conversation brought to you by AARP. And we are talking about the Land Development Code reform. We are presenting you the recommendations that have been made. Now, this next question is a little lengthy, panelists, so please bear with me and listen to what our friend Andrew wants to ask. He says, first, great to see these changes happening, better late than never. He says, my question is also about equity and affordability. Purchasing by developers and sometimes out-of-state investors often serve to push up housing prices, making it difficult for people to purchase homes and pushing up taxes for others. Policies that could limit this gentrifying effect could include limiting home purchases to residents and their family members and stakeholder-oriented landlords, etc. Capping the number of units a single company can own. Are these things that the Land Development Code could address? If not, how and where would policies like that be introduced? Whew, thank you, Andrew, for that question. Who would like to touch on that? Or who can?
I can answer that from a national perspective. Unfortunately, as the commenter noted, there have been some big companies that have gone into a lot of communities throughout the country, not just Louisville, a lot of cities, and purchased single family homes and are basically renting them out and displacing, in some cases, some vulnerable renters. So the concern is real. This is not something we should ignore. The good news is that the height of that occurred after the Great Recession. So 2010 to about 2012. So we're not seeing the massive intrusion of this as much as we used to. It's a little hard to use the land use code as a way to solve this problem, but there are some other approaches that the city could be taking that I would really recommend that are apart from this, such as better homeownership education, helping lower income people of color, like understand the mortgage process, helping them make sure they're able to assemble the money to pay for the down payment. Those can help make sure that neighborhoods continue to be places for wealth building through home ownership. And that can be a way to sort of lower the intrusion of these big companies.
All right, thank you so much for that. Anybody else wanted to touch on that? Jump in? All right. Oh, Cathy?
I was just going to say, Chris, isn't there some discussion about potentially limiting the number of ADUs that a particular company might be able to, or owner might be able to purchase? Is that something that's on the table?
That's certainly some comments that we received. Some of that we have to look legally how we would do that in the zoning code. As Yonah mentioned, the zoning code really can't stop a company from buying property. It doesn't really deal with the ownership of the property. So yeah, there's a comment we received on ADUs, and we'll have to look into that and see if it's something that we can legally do. And because Kentucky zoning laws are different than other states' zoning laws, and so we always have to look at those situations and see if what could work somewhere else could actually work here as well.
I tell you, the ADUs, the hot button topic right about now. Someone says they love the idea of ADUs. Will there be any help to have one built if someone was interested in building their own? Would the department offer any assistance in that?
Well, we have, based on comments that we received, and of course we looked at in California where, they have some specific zoning laws on ADUs and communities, that specific cities that do some things to try to incentivize them. Some of the things we've discussed internally, one of the things we want to do is track, if this does get approved, we want to track ADUs and how many get built in the future. We want to look at, what could be considered limitations. We always want to improve the regulations, especially something that's new. So we'll always be looking at that and tracking and reporting back to the Planning Commission and Metro Council about, how that's been working. In addition to that, in terms of trying to incentivize some of them being built, one of the things that we will probably look into is we'll most likely create a website about ADUs, about how the process is used, kind of a Q&A, how we work with our construction review folks in terms of building permits, what are some of the things that people need to be aware of when they're trying to build an ADU in terms of building code as well as the zoning code. In addition, some other communities around the country have actually created some plans for ADUs that can be easily approved by the building departments. And so that's something that we'll probably look at as well as something to try to help citizens of Jefferson County to be able to build these types of units.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. Next question comes from Miss Cindy. She says, my neighborhood, Crescent Hill, has a number of ADUs, both older and just being built or remodeled, as in garages being remodeled. Therefore, if this is allowed now, how is the reform changing things?
Well, I can answer some of that. Some of the existing accessory dwelling units are there because development existed prior to the zoning code. And people can think of old Louisville, but a lot of the old city of Louisville has accessory dwelling units, especially older ones that were built prior to zoning coming into compliance. And also zoning has changed over the years, so there could have been zones that have been previously on those properties that would have allowed a second unit or an accessory dwelling unit to be approved. Unfortunately for today, a lot of the zoning that took place after the implementation of zoning has changed and basically has eliminated by right accessory dwelling units or second units on these properties. And so it's over the years, it's made it harder to build these and not easier. What we're trying to do is hopefully to make it an easier process to get these units built.
All right, and someone did not fill Mr. Andrew in our comments section. He says he thinks he missed it. What was the short answer on how to prevent the ADUs from becoming Airbnbs? Could someone go over that again for him?
So what we're looking to do to change in the current draft right now, it would require them to go through a conditional use permit process to make an ADU a short-term rental. One of the thoughts that we have in terms of changing the current draft is just to prohibit them outright. So it would be a standard as part of the accessory dwelling unit standards in the code. It would just say they would not be allowed to be accessory dwelling units. And with that said, it's fairly easy for us to enforce that because we do have a registration requirement for all short-term rentals within Jefferson County. So we wouldn't be able to register. If that were to happen, we would not be able to register anybody's accessory dwelling.
Okay, I see a lot of questions about homeowner fees or home association fees affecting the ADUs.
That's a difficult one, and Yonah may want to speak to this too. One of our concerns that we have about ADUs and why we think there's going to be limitations for where they can be implemented is that you do have a lot of the newer subdivisions, especially subdivisions created since 1970s, where you've put in, where deed restrictions have been put in place that would basically eliminate the ability for someone to build an accessory dwelling unit. So in terms of how that would affect their fees, I'm not sure about that, but I would say the deed restriction is more likely to impact whether they can actually build them or not, more than the fee.
Yeah, I think that's right, Chris. I mean, just, the reality is that in certain subdivisions, the rules have been established on the private properties of even people who own their own homes that prevent them from doing certain things that the city government allows them to do. So, I mean, as with any public policy, this single change is not going to change everything. So if you live in one of those communities, you may be prevented from building an ADU, but that's not because of the city, it would be because of the homeowner association.
But what I can add to that, for what Yonah just said, one of the things we are looking at, and it is a recommendation in phase 2 of the LDC reform project, is to look at deed restrictions. Primarily, I think we can probably impact, or the Planning Commission can impact new subdivisions and their deed restrictions in terms of reviewing them at time of subdivision approval. So that's something we will look at. In terms of how we could impact existing ones, that probably falls outside of the Land Development Code, and that would be something that we have to look at as a separate item.
All right, so much information. Keep the questions coming. It looks we have just about another, 19 minutes to get in on this conversation. And again, we thank you so much for spending your Tuesday evening with us. Sometimes I get the days of the week mixed up since quarantine. So, but today is Tuesday. Thank you so much for spending this Tuesday evening with us. Mr. Ed, the next question comes from Mr. Ed Henson, and he says, could elimination of floor to area ratios make it harder for neighborhoods to protect themselves from overly aggressive development projects? Who would like to tackle that one?
Well, what I would say is, if floor area ratio is not used that often in residential development, you see it more used in non-residential development, commercial mixed use, industrial uses. And it's certainly not used very often in combination with other limiting factors such as, large setbacks or restrictive building height limitations. Some of the biggest things we see in the Land Development Code that would limit overly aggressive, development, as some people might call it, or as the questioner called it, would be building heights and setbacks and things like that. Not necessarily floor area ratio. What we see in terms of how it affects public or development is really small developers, individuals who own property in basically would have been considered the old city of Louisville, and that had lots that were created prior to zoning, and so they wouldn't meet, say, minimum lot sizes, and they wouldn't need the floor area ratio. It impacts them from being able to improve their property, but it doesn't really impact that much new development. Certainly, it doesn't affect it out in the suburb. I don't think I've ever seen anybody try to have an FAR issue out in the suburbs where they had to, say, rezone the property because of it. But you see that sometimes in the older parts of the community.
All right. Now, we've talked about the structures, but also land development also entails what's around and in the community. And this is a good question. What reforms will be created and altered to address liquor store densities in urban communities? And I know firsthand from working in West Louisville for several years, there are liquor stores on every single corner. And there have been several different gatherings and rallies and calls to stop that. And so does this project, does it entail any restrictions on that?
So I think I'll answer that one. So in phase 2, we do have a recommendation to look at that in terms, not just liquor stores, but in other uses that sell liquor too, especially in areas where you have a high density of liquor sales. So we are going to be looking at that. Some other communities have looked at that as well. And so we will be researching what they have done and then what basically legally we can do in the state of Kentucky to do something similar. So that will be a project we'll look at. It'll take a little longer. That's why it's not in phase 1. It's going to be a longer project to put something like that together. But it is in the list of phase 2 for us to look at.
All right, great. Anyone else wanted to piggyback off of that question? No? All right. Let's see, we've got more questions coming in. And again, we thank everyone for taking the time to join us on this evening for an update to this conversation. All right. All right, someone said, this is an anonymous question. Has any thought been given to including, again, accessory commercial units in the reforms or corner commercial rights, eliminating parking minimums inside of the Waterson?
Oh, I can answer that question, a little bit of that question. We've had changed some of the parking regulations already, actually prior to the LDC reform project. We did get a resolution from Metro Council asking us to look at that. And we actually, for what we consider the older parts of the community, the old city of Louisville areas, eliminated the minimum parking requirements for residential development. In addition, I would say, I wouldn't say drastically, but we had a major reduction in all minimum parking requirements across the board and looked at how we handle the minimum requirements for the code. And we will be probably looking at some more changes to the parking regulation in regard to some of our maximum parking requirements as well. And that's something that's coming separate from the LDC reform project, but that'll be something we're going to be looking at as well.
All right, Chris, thank you so much. I tell you, we just keep throwing the ball your way, but let me tell you, keep hitting it out of the park. We appreciate all of your knowledge. Question from Mr. Tony. He says, beyond market garden and community garden expansion, what is meant by other means in the urban architectural recommendation that states it is recommended that cities facilitate and allow urban architectural in the form of community gardens, market gardens, and other means?
Well, we currently allow market gardens and community gardens as part of the Land Development Code. I think as Cathy mentioned in her review of the 6 amendments that we're working with, we are trying to further reduce some limitations that have been found with those regulations in terms of limiting where these uses can take place. And so we are going to be working to try to reduce some of those barriers and allow more of those uses within the community.
All right, looks like we've had almost just about 10 minutes left in this conversation. So go ahead and continue to place your comments there, or comments or questions there in the chat, and we'll get to you coming up here in a bit, or as many as we can get. And then I'll allow each of the panelists to have a final comment, and then I guess update us on the next step in the process. Okay, someone says, if I build an ADU and 4 people live in it and they all own cars, will they all be parking in front of the home with the ADU?
Well, currently the accessory apartment provision that we have in the code with a conditional use permit has a parking requirement. We're not really looking at changing any of that with the code. They would still have to meet the parking requirements of the Land Development Code. I wouldn't say they would all be parking in front of the property, but again, they would have to meet the requirements of the code for parking and where that would be located.
I would also say quickly that there are 2 things that should reduce the commenter's concern about this parking issue. One is that the likelihood that somebody who's renting an ADU or staying in an ADU is going to have 4 cars is very small, because remember, these are small properties. Like, we're talking about 800 square feet. We're not talking about large families with 4 adult members, all of whom have cars. That would be very unlikely to see. But even if we did see that, if you look at other examples across the country where more ADUs have been built than we see in Louisville, we don't actually see this parking crunch coming up. Neighborhoods aren't experiencing a big influx of cars. So this is, a reasonable thing to be concerned about, but it hasn't played out in other communities.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Yonah, for expanding upon that. And I saw someone in the chat gave some other examples of some ADUs, like carriage houses and garages that have additions or basements and things like that. And so thanks so much for providing us visual for that. This question right here, it's been mentioned that phase 1 will reduce residential setbacks. Is this for existing properties, infill sites, or new developments?
It wouldn't affect infill. So the changes that we're looking at would change new development. Any development that would fall under infill requirements, this change would not impact. They would still have to meet their infill requirements.
All right. All right. Well, looks as if we are just about out of time here. What's the next step in the process? If you can walk us through, how much time we have. I know you said it could take like 12 to 18 months as we're in this process. What's the next step in this process? What's the next step?
Before they answer that, Ms. Krystal, can I just ask, there's 2 questions, 2 people asked the same question, so I just want to make sure we throw that out there. Yes. Michael Seal and Deborah Turner both asked, how many ADUs will be permitted per principal residence? 1, more than 1? Is there a limit?
That's a good question. It would only allow 1 ADU per property. So it wouldn't allow for them to have 2 or 3 ADUs. It would only allow them to have 1.
Okay. What's next? And if you want to tackle that question,
I can tackle it. So Currently, we're in an open comment period for phase one. That will actually ends here on March 18th. And then the next step would be we go to the planning committee of the Planning Commission on March 22nd, where we'll have some more discussions about the 6 amendments we're talking about, any changes that we're proposing to those. As I mentioned today, there are some things that we are going to change based on comments that we received. So we'll discuss those at the planning committee. Once the planning committee is comfortable that we're ready to go to a public hearing, then we would schedule a public hearing with the planning commission. And then the planning commission holds its public hearing and will make a recommendation to Metro Council for their review.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Chris. Before we get out of here, and I'm going to throw it back to Ms. Tahisha, but I want to give each of you an opportunity to provide whatever closing statements or to address our guests tonight, and just talk about why this is such an important initiative and why them being here tonight was so important. Cathy, we'll start with you.
Okay. So I guess I would just say that, I think these first set of recommendations are purposefully somewhat limited in scope. And, as we move forward, I hope that we're able to discuss other changes that might, have greater impact on our access to affordable housing in the community. And, as the pandemic comes to an end, hopefully we're going to be able to engage in more face-to-face meetings. And we'll also probably be continuing to have these virtual meetings. And so hopefully, folks can participate in the way that makes the most sense for them. Because, I think the reality really is, and that's something that we just have to pay attention to, is that our existing housing practices are just, unsustainable. And I think it's really past time for us to, be having these discussions and thinking about the changes that are going to reduce, racial inequities and increase access to safe and affordable housing. So my plea to everyone is to please stay engaged, to please stay, be a part of this process and learn about the recommendations that are yet to come, and make sure that you're attending these meetings and have your voices heard.
All right, Cathy, very well said. Thank you so much. Ms. Kelly.
Sure, I would just echo some of the things that Cathy just mentioned. I think that this is, set up to be a long-term process. This is just, reminding everyone that this is just the first phase of things, and to encourage people as much as they can to continue to be engaged in the process. And I think that, there's some recommendations down the line, I think, that have a potential to more directly affect housing affordability, which I think is a key concern that we've heard from folks tonight, and I think is kind of a key concern in the city overall. And I would just also say that I think, that these changes to the Land Development Code are an important foundation for kind of setting the stage for housing affordability, but wouldn't be, a silver bullet in and of themselves, that there needs to be other kinds of policy changes to come along with that. So, and I thank everybody for participating tonight, and thanks for having me.
Kelly, thank you so much. We appreciate your 2 cents. Absolutely. Mr. Yonah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me as well. I would also like to reinforce, what Kelly just pointed out, which is that no individual change like this is going to solve every problem out there. Unfortunately, I wish it were so easy. We're gonna have to continue pushing on multiple fronts. A lot of us are very concerned about housing affordability. A lot of the zoning changes we're talking about will help. But we need other resources too, like investing directly in new affordable housing, and finding other means like that. So, it's a multi-stage, multifaceted initiative. And I think this is a really important key element of it. And I'm really excited to be able to participate in this tonight. So thank you so much for inviting me, and have a great night.
All right, Mr. Yonah. And last, certainly not least, Mr. Chris, who's been the Babe Ruth of the night, trying his best to hit all of those questions out of the park. Mr. Chris, you have the last words.
Well, like I said, I just want to remind people that we need everybody's input and involvement in this process. The more people can be involved, the better. And we appreciate everybody's participation tonight and asking questions. And staff is available to ask questions as well in the future. You can contact louisvilleky.gov and go to planning and design. As mentioned in the chat function, where we have our website regarding the LDC reform project, and we'll be happy to talk to you and answer any questions that you have regarding this first phase, but also any of the other two phases that we'll be hopefully working on in the future. So again, thank you, and hope everybody has a good night.
Mr. Chris, thank you so much. And we want to thank you, yes, you, each and every one of you that took time out of your evening to truly be a concerned citizen, to exercise your voice and to sit and gain information. We want to thank you so much for being a part of this change. So without further ado, I'm throwing it back over to you, Ms. Tahisha.
Thank you, Ms. Krystal, and thank you to all of our panelists tonight. I really appreciate you all being here to give information and some facts about the Land Development Code. I hope this was helpful to the people who attended. You will, by Thursday, receive a recording of tonight's session. So if you want to go back and listen to an answer, you'll have that opportunity. We will also send out the phase 6 recommendations, so you'll have that PowerPoint. And we just encourage you all to get involved. You know, AARP really believes in citizen advocacy. And as you heard Chris mention, you know, because of things that they've heard, they're already making some changes or suggesting some changes. So please get involved. Please, you know, care about what's going on in our community. Let's make it better. And, you know, let's make housing affordable, because we are facing a crisis. So with that, thank you and good night.